We knew about deepfake technology in 2017. Nobody was listening, nobody cared, and nobody did anything about it. At one stage, one of the largest deepfake porn websites, 17 million people were visiting it every month. The tech platforms are responsible for the exponential rise in deepfake sexual abuse. As far as I'm concerned, we are only in the situation we are now, where tens of thousands and millions of women are being victimized because of Google.
Professor Clare McGlynn, welcome to the Sex and Space podcast. Really excited to have you here talking today. So thank you for being with us. And I wondered if for our listeners, you could perhaps introduce yourself and what you do.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm a professor of law at Durham University in the UK. And I work mainly around the areas of violence against women and girls. But particularly, I'd say over the last 8 to 10 years or so, what I've been doing is working with victims and women's rights organisations and politicians to try and address online abuse that we're facing through legal measures. That's my main area.
And can you tell us a bit about how you got involved in this work? What's your story?
So I've always been interested in feminism and how the law interacts with feminism, basically the law's failings. And that's taken me into a lot of different areas. I've done work around the judiciary and judges, but also recently violence against women and girls. So doing a lot of work around pornography and such like. And it was just 10 years ago when this kind of what was then called revenge porn just started arising. And some women's organisations I was working with were saying, what is this? What's happening? And what can we do about it? And it just kind of went from there, really.
One of the things that I wanted to talk about today was image-based sexual abuse. And for our listeners who might not be familiar with what that term means, could you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, sure. So like I say, about 10 years ago, people were beginning to hear about this problem, and it was called then revenge porn. And what that tended to mean was just a kind of malicious ex-boyfriend who was posting nudes online. But my colleagues and I and victims just found this term really problematic because it assumed that the woman had done something wrong, it was revenge. And victims don't understand this material as porn, and porn tends to mean, a kind of consensual material. So my colleague Erica Rackley and I came up with this idea of image-based sexual abuse to try and just better explain what this is about. So it is abusive material. It's mostly sexual and about sexual harassment. And so this is kind of like an umbrella term that includes lots of different forms of abuse that we can talk about. But the idea is that it better reflects victims' experiences, really, and covers the whole range of ways in which this abuse is perpetrated, not just an ex-boyfriend sharing, an intimate image.
And this issue is a very gendered one, and I wonder if we could maybe talk about that for a little bit in terms of who that's impacting.
Yeah. The reality is it is gendered. It's predominant. I mean, there's a range of different, experiences, but at a very general level, you're talking predominantly men perpetrating abuse, predominantly against women and girls. And this is partly because what we're talking about is sexual images being, released in the internet or being amended, like with deepfakes. And the reality just is this impacts on women and girls more. We're still in a culture that, blames women for sharing any sexual images, that, that kind of double standard of, against women and against men. And it does vary, but at a very general level, that's why for women, having a nude image shared online is so much more significant than for many men. Not all men, but for many men.
And I've heard you kind of talk about this sense of like the invisible threat for a lot of women, like that something's going to happen to them. Could you maybe talk to our listeners about what you mean with that term?
Well, so I think particularly now that we've got AI technology, people might be familiar with, referring to, say, deepfakes or deepfake porn. And this is where someone can take an ordinary image of you from a social media profile and use AI to make it either nude or into a sexual video. And anyone can do that. These tools are very easily accessible online, free to use. So what it means is that pretty much any of us, but it affects women and girls more, could have someone make a nude or a pornographic video of us at any moment without our consent, and then it can just go out there into the world with all sorts of potentially adverse effects. And so this is like, yeah, like I say, this is like an invisible threat now kind of hanging over women and girls, because at any moment this could pop up on the internet. And the fact is that it pops up on the internet and is then used to abuse and harass us. That's the problem. You know, it's not that it's just an image, a sexual image out there. It's that it then becomes a form of abuse, and it's a violation. So, yeah, the invisible threat is this idea that, you know, that many women and girls are used to every day having to manage, you know, where we walk on the street, who we sit next to on the bus, who's the weirdo looking at us while we're trying to buy our coffee, you know, we're trying to, you know, all the time weigh up threats and harassment physically. And this is now just another layer of that threat, how we're having to negotiate and manage our lives.
And what kind of laws are in place to manage this at the moment?
So it varies hugely from country to country, as you would imagine. I mean, I guess at one level, over the last 10 years or so, there has been a global movement to try and introduce laws, and particularly criminal laws, to try to, first of all, say that this is wrong. And I think there's a really important message here from the law, because it says to victims, we see you, we understand you, and we recognise this is harmful. So there has been that global movement, but it varies hugely between different countries. You know, there are some international agreements now that say sharing intimate images without consent should be unlawful and criminalised. So that there are laws, but it varies considerably between different countries.
And I think I read somewhere in maybe an article that you'd published or maybe on your website that there's been quite a focus, more of a focus on managing the distribution of these images rather than the actual creation of them. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that, maybe?
Yeah, so this is about how things have shifted over the last number of years, because when these forms of abuse were first appearing, and, you know, women were first being victimized, it was mostly about the distribution, so the sharing of intimate images, say, that had been taken without consent, or sometimes shared but then distributed without consent. So that was the immediate concern. So that's why there was lots of laws around the world prohibiting the distribution of intimate images without consent. But if you think about it, what that never did was stop people taking images without consent. And also, when we think about the deepfakes and the AI, it doesn't stop them creating them without consent. And that's what we've been focusing on more recently, in the sense of, if you never create a deep fake without someone's consent, there's no risk of it being distributed.
Yeah.
You know? So it's trying to, if you like, get at that root cause.
Yeah.
But also, you know, we often don't talk about enough about how images are taken of us without consent. It happens to women an awful lot, unfortunately. And so trying to focus on prohibiting those images being taken without consent has also just become really important.
I think especially because, I mean, from the seams of it, those kinds of apps, you know, where people create deepfake porn are very, very accessible. I mean, I've even been scrolling in my TikTok and I've seen an app where you can like upload your crush and, you know, you can, and I'm just scrolling on TikTok. I'm not searching for that kind of stuff. It's just being fed to me. And so I wonder, what role do tech companies and social media platforms play in helping facilitate those kinds of images being made, and what should they be doing to help prevent it?
The tech platforms are responsible for the exponential rise in deepfake sexual abuse. They are absolutely, responsible for it. And there's a number of reasons why. Google, for example, for many, many years, and it still does, highly ranks deepfake sexual abuse websites and nudify apps. For many years, you could just type in how to create a deepfake, how to nudify, and instantly it brought up these websites. So as far as I'm concerned, we are only in the situation we are now, where tens of thousands, millions of women are being victimized because of Google. It refused to act for so many years. It's changed its policies now a little bit, but it refused to act. But it's not just Google. As you say, the likes of TikTok, Instagram, and all sorts of others, they've been profiting from this abuse because they take paid adverts for these nudify sites. And they're making money from this. And they're, algorithmically, as you say, showing it to people like yourselves and all sorts of others. So they've been making profit from our abuse, and they've facilitated it. We just wouldn't be in this mess if it wasn't for them. And I think this is sometimes what we forget. So when I think of, for example, young teenage boys who are using nudify apps and accessing this material, of course they should take some responsibility, but the main responsibility is on us as adults who've let this happen, because we've allowed these adverts on TikTok. So not surprisingly, a 13-year-old boy thinks it's normal because it's on TikTok. We've let that situation take hold. So they're, they are responsible.
Yeah, because they're kind of, I guess, when you're that young and you're seeing it, you're not even looking for it, you're just being kind of given it on a site that you're allowed to use once you're above 13, I believe.
Yeah.
Of course, and especially when you haven't been given the critical thinking skills at that age to understand, all the nuances of that, you are just going to see it and go, this seems like something that I should be allowed to use, and so I'm going to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the problem with this stuff being so easily accessible through our mainstream social media, because it makes it seem normal. And you're right, it makes it seem like, oh, well, everyone's doing it. What's the problem? So I guess I'm a lawyer, in particular a criminal lawyer. That's one of the things about that. It's not to criminalize young boys, but the aim is to have that message that this is wrong. It really is. It's just fundamentally wrong. And hopefully, if we have good education in schools, etc., that can be part of a conversation about what do you do online? What do you do with images? Whose images do you share? And all that sort of thing. Because although we are talking about sexually explicit deepfakes, you can, of course, use this tech in lots of different ways to bully and harass people.
That was a question I was going to ask you, actually, because I think you've mentioned the need for a culture change, and I was wondering, what kind of educational, what kind of messages do we need to be sharing with our young people to make sure that they are understanding how harmful this behavior can be?
Yeah, it's really hard because the horse is bolted almost. The millions are already accessing these websites, but yeah, we absolutely have to start. I think it's about these conversations around ethical use of technology, isn't it? It's a broader conversation. You should not take someone's photo without their consent. You should not share that image without their consent. Hopefully it is against the law, but just because it's wrong, it's unkind. It's harmful and it's violating. So at one level, it's those sorts of conversations which are, they need time. And they need space, and it also needs to not be blaming individuals for either sharing images or blaming these young boys necessarily who are already been doing it, because you need to bring them in and have a conversation about it, don't we? So that's at the school level. I mean, at a societal level, there's a lot of work to be done again as well, and it is difficult to get across the harms. I think people don't quite realize and understand just how devastating this can be. I guess we just have to keep trying to share, those stories and experiences and research.
Can you talk to us a bit about there's a campaign that you've been working on, Stop Image-Based Abuse, I think with Glamour, if that's correct. Could you talk to our listeners a bit about what you're doing with that campaign?
Yeah, so this is a campaign, with Glamour magazine, with the organisation Not Your Porn, End Violence Against Women and Girls Coalition, and survivor activist Jodie. And our aim is to try and look at this problem holistically and comprehensively. So politicians are very keen to introduce criminal laws sometimes, which is, a really important first step, but that is, my goodness, that is just the beginning. And so we're trying to say you need civil laws to allow victims to get material taken down, for example, so that you can, get material removed or deleted, that we need comprehensive, good education and culture change, that survivor organisations need to be funded so that, for example, if you have your images shared online, you need to get them taken down. And so we need the organisations properly funded and resourced to get that taken down. So the idea is just to say, look, this is a big problem and we need comprehensive solutions right across the board, not just, the criminal law, if you like, but much more widely and broadly.
And what kind of wins have you had from that campaign so far? I think I saw something from January about the UK going to introduce a consent-based law. Was that correct?
Yeah, so at the moment it's not law yet. It's just about to be there, which will criminalise creating sexually explicit deepfakes, and it'll also really importantly target what we kind of call solicitation. So that's when someone asks someone else to make it for you.
Right.
Because what we know from the world around Nudify and particularly deepfakes is that people go on, well, and it is mostly men, go on lots of these community forums and they're asking each other, oh, how'd you do this? Could you do this? Can you deepfake this person for me? It's that sort of community building. And so this is how the survivor activist Jodie experienced deepfake abuse. Someone she knew went on one of these forums, took her images from her social media profile and asked others to make really very violent, horrific deepfakes of her. And so a key part of this law has been to say it's not just if you create them, but if you go and ask others to do it as well, that's a problem and that's a crime as well. So that's what's happening here in the UK. Yeah.
And so maybe just in the context of the UK, what is the process if you realize someone's, put these images up online of you, where do you start? Like what do you, how do you handle that?
Yeah. So in the UK, we're very fortunate to have an organisation. It's called the Revenge Porn Helpline, and they do work to take down all of these images. And so if someone was in the UK, the first thing to do would be to contact the Revenge Porn Helpline. They do have a website, an international section, so they have information about what sorts of support organisations and contacts are available in other countries. So that's also a good starting point because very few there are similar organisations in other countries, but not always. So if you were in the UK, that would be the first thing to do. The platforms themselves and social media companies do have reporting mechanisms that you can try and use. And if you're in that situation, do try that. Just stepping back, the problem is they're quite cumbersome sometimes. It's not always as obvious to find how you do that. And sometimes it can take quite a long time, unfortunately. Which is why we need the organisations like the Revenge Porn Helpline to try to be a one-stop shop for someone. This is what's happened. Can you deal with it? And I mean, that's just what we need.
Having a support system where you can kind of go and say, hey, I need this, rather than, I guess, having to piece it all together yourself.
Oh, absolutely. And for the individual victim, this is re-traumatizing because you're basically saying, I have to go online, I have to search for my image, I have to find the URL, I have to report, blah, 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 blah. I mean, the platforms should have better reporting mechanisms because they must do. But we also need these kind of survivor support organisations to help victims so that they're not having to re-traumatise themselves by searching basically for their own abuse, which is what we're asking them to do.
In terms of in all the work that you've done over the years, how have you seen this issue shift over time? So it has, I hesitate, things have improved. I only hesitate because they haven't improved fast enough. They have, because, 10 years ago, we were just talking about revenge porn. That's still a common term, but it's not as much. And people weren't understanding what the harm was and what was going on. So I do think there's been a shift. And there's better recognition now of these forms of abuse and that we need to take action. The only thing is that at the same time, the technology has advanced. So, we do have AI now. We've got the deepfakes now, which has just taken this form of abuse to exponential levels.
at one stage, one of the largest deepfake porn websites, 17 million people were visiting it every month.
Wow.
This is how many people are abusing, are wanting to abuse women and girls. So attitudes have shifted. There is more discussion, there's more recognition, there's more discussion and debate. But at the same time, the technology just keeps on developing, and the use of it, unfortunately, to abuse women and girls and some boys in some contexts just continues.
It's hard to catch up when the tech just keeps racing ahead. And
It is. The only thing I'd say about, because quite often to me, that's politicians say to me, oh, the law is too slow to catch up, and whatever. It's the politicians and the public that are too slow to catch up. Because, for example, about deepfakes, we knew about deepfake technology in 2017. Although it's new in terms of it being so easily accessible, we have known about it for years. It's just nobody was listening, nobody cared, and nobody did anything about it. So I'm always keen to not let politicians, tech companies, etc. off the hook. We could be faster if we cared. Do you know what I mean? If you're talking about fraud and financial corruption, you can bet your bottom dollar that the systems go in place very quickly to stop that. We just need the same sort of motivation around online abuse and harassment.
what do you wish is maybe something that more people knew or understood about this subject? For our listeners at home, if you could maybe, send them a message, what would you want them to know?
That this abuse really hits home at a very deep personal level. So it can be really violating personally to individuals. And this then has ramifications throughout their entire life in many ways. One woman I spoke to, her ex-partner had shared intimate images of her, and it was devastating, and it was life-threatening. She did try and take her own life at one stage, but she described it as torture for her soul. It was so deep, this breach of trust and the pain of other people, viewing this and then harassing her. So it kind of disrupts your trust in people. And this is something that, you can't heal very quickly. It's not like, you get a physical assault you can heal. But this can't, your trust in people, because, and again, with deep fakes and so many things, you don't know sometimes who's done this to you. Who is it in your social group who's done this? And so, it can be devastating. It hurts your soul. And it then, professionally, you've got to remember this is impacting on women and girls, because we're more worried about going online. And we all need an online presence these days. And I don't just mean for, recipes and pictures of dogs or something. I mean to, live our lives and, often professionally. Which employer wants to employ the woman for when you search for her name, it comes up with some deepfake porn, for example. Even if it's fake, this is why I don't like the term fake. It doesn't matter. You wouldn't choose that person. You'd choose someone else. So, it impacts on us at every single level, just at a very, profoundly. It's life-shattering.
I want to come back to what you said about that term fake, because I was reading another article that you did, and you were mentioning possibly a shift from deepfake porn to digital sexual forgeries, I think was the term. I wonder if you could walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, so this is, I find terminology, just at a general level, stepping back, is really important, how we describe things, because it's what tells us what's significant, what's important, and it also then shapes our laws. And the clearest example, I think, of how terminology has shifted is in relation to child sexual abuse images. People used to talk about child porn, but hardly anyone ever does that now, because we realize these are child sexual abuse images. So that's a really good example of how the terminology shifts. Also, we shifted revenge porn to image-based sexual abuse or intimate image abuse or some similar term. I don't like the term deepfake porn for many of the same reasons. First of all, many people may not know the term deepfake actually comes from the Reddit user who first created this technology to make sexually explicit deepfakes. That was his username. And so he's given birth to this term deepfake that we now use right across the world. And the term porn suggests something consensual, whereas this is abusive material. So, I mean, I still sometimes use the term because, you know, we're all familiar with it, but ideally we don't. I try and talk about sexually explicit deepfakes or deepfake sexual abuse. But yeah, thank you for raising. One of the terms that I think is even better is sexual digital forgeries. Now, it was Danielle Keith-Citron and Marianne Franks in the US who first started using this terminology. And I think it's really powerful. You know, forgery, we all know that's wrong. And it's, you know, it's illegal. And so I think talking about digital forgeries, it's true. These are not consensual. They're, you know, dishonest. They're, you know, so I think the term really sums up well the reality. And the term digital forgery is actually used in some of the US legislation that's just been adopted.
Okay.
So you never just know. It might be that we could start using that term to describe this. And that would be better for victims, and it would be better for us all to understand what this is about.
I think language is so important, like you say, when it comes to these things and the way that we think about them. Really has the ability to shape how we use it in conversation. And I guess also to an extent, you know, how some people might think about where the responsibility lies just in that wording.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more. It's really important. So hopefully that might be a shift that we start to see as well.
Well, that's something our listeners can do. They can shift from, you know, deep fakes to, was it sexual
digital forgeries. And I'm, you know, it can be hard. Of course, you know, I'm not saying it's really easy, and I still sometimes will use the term deepfake porn. Sometimes I'll try and say, you know, inverted commas, etc., because it's familiar, you know. But I think it's a process of just shifting. Hopefully, we can.
It takes time, but I think, you know, if you've got that intention behind it, then you get there in the end. You know, you have that intention to change the way that you're talking about it. Another thing I wanted to bring up with you was because I was reading, again, I think your article from April, there was a 2023 report, and it found that 98% of deepfakes were sexually explicit and 99% featured women. And then you also mentioned in the article that when it comes to deepfake detection tools, they have a bias in that they're better at identifying deepfakes of men rather than women, which I was astounded at. I was like, if 99% feature women, how is this tech better at identifying when it's done to men? So I wondered if you could talk us through that.
So I guess the bottom line is most of the AI tech, and including tech detecting deepfakes, is, you know, well, it's programmed not with women in mind, and it's programmed using sources on the web that we're familiar with. So, for example, we know that with AI is discriminatory. It discriminates against particularly Black and minoritized people. It's not very good at recognizing Black or brown faces, and then in the text it's discriminatory for many reasons. So what we find with deepfake detection is that it's just, and this is different from sexually explicit deepfakes, I suppose that's the difference. It's just more used to white male faces that it can pick up and that it's trained on. So when it comes to sexually explicit and women's bodies, it's just not as good at identifying them. And some of that is because of the nature of the internet. And then it's because we've not done enough yet to try and counteract that sort of bias. You know, the same with the AI that we're using. We're baking in discrimination into all our AI activities at the moment in a really challenging way. It's really concerning.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was a few years ago, there was an article and we did some research into an app where you can kind of put your image in and it makes you, you know, different sort of like artistic images, and the ones that women were putting their images in, and they were a lot more sexual than the ones when men put their images in.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. And that still carries on. Yes, you can, yeah, you type in, or it used to be, some of this has slightly changed, but you type in doctor and you get the image of the man, that sort of thing. But you see this in relation to, many times you type in Latina girls into Google. For a long time it was just bringing up porn and stuff. Some of that has now shifted, but it's always kind of like afterwards, after people have raised it, after there's been a campaign, etc. But yeah, those are good examples of the way that AI is just still discriminatory. And that's because of the internet. The internet is awash with porn and sometimes horrific, violent porn. And the internet is reflective of our society, which is patriarchal, which is unequal, with, certain people, particularly Black and minority ethnic people, even more discriminated against.
I wonder, for our listeners who are going, what can we do to help to try and change something? What might you suggest that they can do to help contribute towards this work that you're doing?
So I guess it depends in what circumstances. In any conversations people are having, if one's able to, if it's safe, calling out bad conduct or challenging people, and not even necessarily confronting people, but just, do you think that's okay, sort of question. In all our relationships, we need to be thinking about that and doing that. Maybe it's supporting, campaigns. The survivor activists I talked about, Jodie, whose images were shared online. Well, it was one of her best friends who shared her social media images, and that deepfakes were created. She's got an online petition with change.org about, deepfakes are not porn. Sign that petition and help, for example. And just, responding to politicians, or in your country when there's a discussion about changing the law or something, maybe just getting involved, that sort of thing.
And just before we conclude, I wanted to ask if you could maybe share one of your biggest wins when it comes to the work that you've done in this space.
Oh goodness, that's a difficult one. There have, wins. I mean, I suppose in the UK we have managed to change many of the criminal laws. They're much better than they were, and so many more women and some men are able to secure justice if they want to. I think for me, some of the most significant, it's wins, if you like, or a number of years ago when survivors were saying to me, I can think of a couple of times when they'd hear terms like image-based sexual abuse, and they said, yes, that resonates, and yes, that says something to me. And also research we did on the kind of the harms of image-based abuse, talking about that kind of threat that they feel, and women saying, yeah, I've been heard. So I think for me, it's that sort of feedback from survivors when they feel understood. Because we expect so much of survivors. All of this only changes when basically women predominantly are willing to speak out. So when it feels like they feel validated or something resonates with them, that's what I would call a win.
Is there anything I haven't touched on that you would like to add?
Maybe just another, if anyone, just another thing to bear in mind, if people haven't heard of something called Stop NCII, that's non-consensual intimate images. This is a global platform that if you've taken nudes, for example, and you've shared them and you're worried someone's going to share them online without your consent, you can go to Stop NCII, share a hash, which is like a digital fingerprint of an image. You don't share the actual image, you just share a hash. And that would then be blocked across large numbers of porn sites and social media sites. So it's just another thing to be aware of, that, like I say, if you're worried that someone's about to share an image that you might have sent them, go on Stop NCII, and it's one way to help maybe reduce the risk of those images being shared. And greater knowledge about that might be also something that would be of interest and use.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't know that was sharing a hash was even something that was.
Yeah, so it's yeah, just to make clear, you do not need to share the image. There's a website, and you kind of, I don't know how exactly it works, but it creates this digital fingerprint, what's
Okay.
called a hash. And all the social media, well, lots of the largest social media and porn companies then have that hash that if that image comes near their platform, they know to block it, basically.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's good. It's good. It's clever technology. So
Yeah.
it's just one way that we can, protect ourselves if we need to.
Okay, that's fantastic. Well, we'll make sure to put the link to that in the episode description.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Claire, for your time talking with me today, and I'm sure that our listeners will get a lot out of this episode. So thank you so much for being here, for chatting.
No, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it. It's great. Thanks very much.